Most people think America's deadliest industrial disaster involved an explosion, a fire, a single catastrophic afternoon that made the front page and stayed in the history books. It didn't happen that way at all. The Congressional record for 1936 tells a different story, and it's a record almost nobody has actually read. Buried inside House Labour Committee testimony, alongside court filings from more than 500 civil lawsuits, is the account of a tunnel drilled through a West Virginia mountain, and a death toll so uncertain that historians still argue over it today. Estimates range from the hundreds into the thousands, because the company that hired the men never bothered to count them in the first place. Here's the part that should stop you. The strange detail isn't that men died digging a tunnel. Men have always died digging tunnels. What shocked the physicians who testified in 1936 was how fast it happened weeks, not decades. And what the engineers admitted, under questioning, was that they knew why. So why does a documented mass casualty event, sworn testimony, government hearings, physician reports, surviving court records barely exist in public memory? Why were the death certificates written a certain way? Why can nobody today point to a complete list of names? What did the funeral home ledgers actually record, and what did they leave out? Where did the men who left the project sick and simply died elsewhere get counted if they were counted at all? The paper trail exists. Field reports, medical testimony, a published historical investigation drawing directly from the primary sources. What's missing isn't evidence, it's an answer to the one question this documentary is built to chase. How does a country lose track of hundreds of its own dead in the middle of the 20th century with a federal hearing on the record and call it settled? Today we're opening that record, following it exactly where the testimony leads. To understand why this tunnel exists at all, you have to understand what Union Carbide was building 6 miles downstream. In the late 1920s, Union Carbide and Carbon Corporation, already one of the largest chemical manufacturers in the country, decided to build a metallurgical plant in the town of Alloy, West Virginia, to produce ferrosilicon, an alloy used in steel making. The plant needed two things in enormous quantities: electricity and pure silica. The New River, which ran through Fayette County, offered a solution to the first problem. If you could divert the river's flow through a tunnel bored straight through Gawley Mountain, you could drop the water through a hydroelectric plant and generate enough power to run the entire alloy facility. Union Carbide created a subsidiary, the New Kanawha Power Company, specifically to build it, and hired a contractor, Reinhardt and Dennis Company of Charlottesville, Virginia, to do the digging. The tunnel would run more than 3 miles through the mountain. Standard practice for a bore of that size in 1930 was already well understood. Drill wet so the water suppresses the rock dust, ventilate constantly, and if you hit a vein of unusually toxic material, slow down. All three of those precautions cost time and money. All three of those precautions were, according to survivor testimony and later court filings, largely abandoned inside Hawk's Nest. Here's the detail that makes this story different from an ordinary construction accident. Partway through the dig, engineers realized the mounting wasn't ordinary rock. It was almost pure silicon dioxide silica, in some sections measured at over 90% purity. That's not incidental information. Silica of that purity was valuable. Some of it was reportedly hauled out and used directly in the alloy plant's own production process. The company didn't just fail to notice the danger. By multiple later accounts, it recognized the material had commercial value, and that recognition may have been part of why the dry drilling method continued rather than switching to a slower, safer wet method. Pure crystalline silica dust, when inhaled in high concentrations over a short period, doesn't cause the slow-developing disease most doctors of the era associated with silicosis, a disease usually seen in miners after 10 or 20 years of chronic low-level exposure. It causes something else: acute silicosis, a rapid scarring of lung tissue that can kill a healthy man within months of exposure. Nobody working inside that tunnel had ever seen a case develop that fast, because almost nobody had ever been exposed to concentrations that high. The men who took that job had no idea what fast-acting silicosis even was. Most of them didn't know the word. What they knew was that the tunnel was full of a white dust, so thick that some days you couldn't see the man working 10 feet in front of you, and that within weeks, some of the men who'd started alongside them were already too weak to climb out of the shaft. What happened to the workers who kept going anyway is where this gets difficult to watch. Roughly 3,000 men worked on the Hawk's Nest project over its construction. The overwhelming majority, most estimates put it at 70 to 80%, were black migrant labourers, many of them recruited from the Deep South during the Depression, when the promise of steady construction wages was enough to bring men hundreds of miles from Alabama, Georgia, and the Carolinas to a West Virginia hillside. This detail matters for reasons beyond demographics. It shaped who got which job inside the tunnel, and it shaped who got left out of the record afterward. Survivor and family testimony collected in the years following the disaster consistently describes a segregated labour hierarchy. White workers were disproportionately assigned to jobs outside the tunnel or in better ventilated sections, while black workers were disproportionately assigned to the driest, dustiest interior drilling positions, the exact conditions that produced the fastest, most severe silica exposure. The work itself was brutal by any standard. Drills bored into rock walls that were, in places, composed of crystallized silica, so fine it hung in the air like fog. Without wet suppression, that dust didn't settle, it circulated through the tunnel on the ventilation system, if there was meaningful ventilation at all. Workers described going into the tunnel and coming out coated white, head to boot, breathing through cloths tied over their faces because the company didn't reliably supply respirators, and the respirators that did exist were often inadequate for particles that fine. Doctors who treated the workers in the surrounding towns began noticing something strange almost immediately. Men in their 20s and 30s, otherwise healthy, coming in with breathing difficulties that should have taken decades to develop, if they developed at all. Some died within a year of starting the job. The company's own physician, according to later testimony, was aware of the pattern early, but the men kept coming to work, because Depression-era West Virginia offered few alternatives, and because most of them had no way of knowing the job itself was the cause. There's a particular cruelty in acute silicosis as a cause of death. It doesn't look dramatic. No headline-worthy collapse. No single date anyone could point to and say that's when the disaster happened. Men simply got weaker over weeks or months, struggled to breathe, and died sometimes back home in the towns they'd left to take the job, sometimes still in West Virginia, far from any family able to claim the body or ask questions about how it happened. That last detail is the hinge this story turns on. Because when men without local family died in a company town, someone still had to bury them. And what happened to those bodies is the part of this story that stayed buried quite literally for years. Local officials eventually acknowledged that a large number of men had died. What they wouldn't do, for years, was say how many or where the bodies had gone. The answer to that question turned out to involve a cornfield, a funeral home, and a set of graves that were never marked with names. In the town of Summersville, West Virginia, a black-owned funeral home operated by a man named Hamilton White was contracted, according to multiple later investigations and survivor accounts, to handle burials for workers who died during the tunnel construction and had no family able to claim the body or pay for transport home. The arrangement, as it's been reconstructed by historians and investigators in the decades since, worked like this. The company paid a set fee per body. White's funeral home buried the dead in a field near the Whippoorwill area unmarked. In most cases without coffins that met even the minimal standards of the time, with no headstones, and critically, incomplete or non-existent records of exactly who was interred where. This is the point where the story stops being just a workplace tragedy and becomes something closer to an active erasure. Because unmarked mass graves aren't an accident of poverty alone, they're what happens when a system decides that keeping accurate records of certain deaths isn't worth the paperwork. Historians examining the case afterward found that basic identifying information many companies routinely kept on workers' full names, addresses, next of kin was frequently missing, incomplete, or simply never collected for the migrant labourers most affected by the dust exposure. The initial official death toll reported for the Hawk's Nest project was remarkably low a number in the dozens, officially attributed to pneumonia rather than silicosis, in company and local records. Pneumonia was, in a sense, technically accurate. Acute silicosis frequently causes fatal secondary lung infections that present, on a death certificate, as pneumonia. But labelling the cause of death pneumonia rather than silicosis had an obvious practical effect. It obscured the pattern. It made 3,000 separate pneumonia deaths look like an unfortunate coincidence rather than 3,000 men exposed to the same lethal dust in the same mountain. It took investigators, journalists, and eventually congressional researchers years to reconstruct something closer to an accurate toll. Estimates that emerged from later investigations ranged enormously, from roughly the low hundreds up toward figures cited by some researchers approaching 2,000, depending on how death records, funeral home logs, and worker rosters were cross-referenced, and how many undocumented or unrecorded deaths occurred among migrant workers who'd simply left the area sick and died somewhere else without any death ever being formally connected to the tunnel at all. Most historians researching the incident since have settled on a widely cited figure of around 764 deaths tied directly to the project and number itself, treated by many researchers as a probable undercount, given how many men simply vanished from the historical record entirely. That gap between the official pneumonia-labeled dozens and the true toll historians now believe ran into the hundreds is the single fact this entire episode exists to document. And it's the fact that almost stayed buried permanently, if not for what happened 5 years later in Washington, D.C. By 1936, journalists, labour advocates, and a small group of surviving workers had put enough pressure on Congress that a hearing was finally scheduled. For the first time, men who had crawled out of that tunnel alive would be asked, on the record, to describe what they'd seen, and a company that had spent 5 years calling this an ordinary construction project would have to answer for it in public. In January of 1936, the House of Representatives Labour Committee opened hearings into the Hawk's Nest tunnel construction, a direct response to mounting pressure from labour organisations, investigative journalists who had begun publishing accounts of the death toll, and lawsuits already working their way through West Virginia courts. The hearings brought forward testimony from surviving workers, family members of the deceased, physicians who had treated the sick and dying, and engineers who had worked on the project. What emerged across days of testimony was a picture the company had spent years trying to keep fragmented, workers describing tunnels so thick with dust that visibility dropped to a few feet. Physicians describing a wave of respiratory deaths concentrated almost entirely among a specific, identifiable group of workers who'd been assigned to the driest interior sections, and engineers acknowledging, under questioning, that the company had known the rock was unusually high in silica content well before construction finished. The testimony also confirmed something the pneumonia-labeled death certificates had been designed to obscure. Physicians who examined surviving and deceased workers found consistent, severe lung scarring characteristic of acute silicosis, not the chronic, slow-developing version doctors typically diagnosed after decades of low-level exposure, but a fast, aggressive form that matched exactly what you'd expect from short-term exposure to extremely high concentrations of pure silica dust. Company representatives, for their part, largely maintained during the hearings that safety standards common to the industry at the time had been followed, and that the severity of the health outcomes could not have been reasonably anticipated. That defence ran directly against testimony from workers and independent physicians describing a work environment where masks were inconsistently provided, wet drilling methods were largely abandoned in favour of faster dry drilling, and warning signs, men collapsing, men dying within months of starting the job, had been visible for well over a year before the tunnel's completion, with no significant change in practice in response. The congressional hearings didn't result in criminal charges against Union Carbide or Reinhardt and Dennis. No executive went to prison. But they accomplished something the company had spent years trying to prevent. They placed a detailed, sworn, on the record account of what happened inside that mountain into the permanent congressional record, a document that couldn't be quietly buried the way the death certificates had been. Alongside the congressional hearings, a wave of civil lawsuits moved through the courts. More than 500 separate claims eventually filed against Reinhardt and Dennis on behalf of injured and deceased workers and their families. The legal outcome of those suits is, in its own way, as damning as anything from the hearings themselves. Cases were consolidated, moved to friendlier jurisdictions, and settled for amounts that later investigators and legal historians widely characterized as a small fraction of the actual damages claimed in many instances, reportedly in the range of a few $100s per worker, occasionally alongside allegations of irregularities in how juries and venues were selected. For the families of men who never came home, the settlements amounted to a fraction of what a life, by any accounting, should have been worth. The hearings ended, the settlements were paid, and the story that had briefly made national news in the mid-1930s largely receded from public memory for the next several decades, resurfacing only when later historians and journalists went looking for it, and found a documented disaster that had somehow never made it into standard American history textbooks at all. The Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster occupies an unusual place in American labor history, widely cited by historians and public health researchers as the deadliest single industrial disaster in the country's history, and almost entirely absent from popular memory. Its documented consequences were real, if incomplete. The case became a frequently cited example in the decades-long push to establish clearer occupational safety standards around silica dust exposure, contributing to a slow tightening of industrial hygiene practices and awareness of acute silicosis as a distinct, fast-developing hazard. Separate from the chronic form doctors had previously assumed was the only version of the disease. Labour historians point to Hawks Nest as one of the events that helped build momentum over subsequent decades toward the kind of workplace safety regulation that wouldn't be codified at the federal level until the creation of OSHA in 1970, nearly 4 decades later. But the more immediate reckoning accountability for the specific decisions made inside that tunnel between 1930 and 1932 never fully arrived. No one was criminally charged. The settlements paid to survivors and families were, by the assessment of most historians who've studied the case, grossly inadequate to the scale of what happened. And the precise death toll the number this entire investigation exists to try to answer remains, to this day, not definitively known. Estimates still range by the hundreds, because the underlying records were never complete in the first place, and because an unknown number of men who left the project sick simply died elsewhere, uncounted, disconnected on paper from the tunnel that killed them. The graves near Summersville remain, for the most part, unmarked. Some efforts have been made in more recent decades by historians, by descendants, by local commemorative projects to identify and memorialize the men buried there, but the fundamental problem investigators faced in 1936 hasn't gone away, when a system is built to not record certain names in the first place. There's often no complete record left to recover, even generations later. Martin Cherniack's 1986 book, The Hawk's Nest Incident, America's Worst Industrial Disaster, remains the most comprehensive historical account of the case, drawing on the congressional record, court filings, and surviving contemporary documentation to reconstruct as complete a picture as the historical record allows. It's worth noting explicitly, even the most rigorous modern accounts of Hawk's Nest are working from an incomplete record by design. That incompleteness isn't a gap in the historical research, it's the point of the story. What makes the Hawk's Nest Tunnel disaster different from most stories on this channel isn't that evidence was destroyed. It's that evidence was never created in the first place deliberately, in the case of hundreds of migrant workers whose names were never properly recorded, whose deaths were labelled with a cause that obscured the real one, and whose graves were left unmarked in a field that most people driving past it today have no reason to know is there at all. The 1936 Congressional Hearing didn't fix that. It couldn't. What it did was force a company that had spent 5 years managing this story privately to answer questions publicly, under oath, with a permanent record kept. That record is why we know as much as we do today, and it's also, in its gaps and its estimates and its approximately and its as many as, a record of exactly how much this country was willing to let disappear before anyone was required to write any of it down. If you want to go deeper into the primary sources, the 1936 congressional testimony, Cherniack's research, and the surviving court records from the civil suits I've linked what's publicly available in the description. This is the kind of history that doesn't survive on its own. It survives because people keep asking where the names went.